The United States of America, the land of dreams, the land of promises. For some, it is a kingdom of endless opportunities. But for others like Jamal Okoye, it is a battlefield. Jamal came here with a dream of something better, a dream that turned into long nights in the cold, empty pockets, and a world that refused to see him. Jamal had not always been a man of the streets. There was a time where he had a home, a life, a place where he belonged. But dreams demand sacrifice, and it began the day he left Nigeria. The journey was brutal. Days crammed in a truck, crossing the unforgiving desert where many never made it through. Then came the sea, vast, merciless. The boat was overcrowded, rocking violently, the scent of fear heavier than the salt in the air. He clung to the wooden edge, knuckles white, eyes locked on the endless darkness. A child cried. A woman whispered prayers. Someone fell overboard. No one spoke of it. For hours, the ocean raged, threatening to swallow them all. And then, just as dawn broke, the storm calmed. They had made it through the night. Jamal didn't know what awaited him on the other side. He only knew one thing. He hadn't survived all this just to be forgotten. He had no papers, no rights, no protection, and yet he refused to break. He had always been smart, always been capable. But in this country, intelligence meant nothing without documentation. He was a ghost, a man who existed but was never acknowledged. He washed dishes in restaurants that paid him under the table, carried heavy crates in warehouses where no one knew his name, scrubbed floors in buildings where he was invisible. The American dream was supposed to be within reach. But for men like him, it was a mirage, always just out of grasp. He lived from street to street, corner to corner. Some nights, he found shelter in abandoned buildings. Other nights, he laid his head on cardboard, praying the cold wouldn't take him in his sleep. He never begged, never stole. He kept his head down and did what he had to do to survive. But survival was not the same as living. He had seen men like him turn bitter, turn reckless, get swallowed by the streets. He had seen the desperation that led good people into bad decisions. But Jamal was not like them. He had promised himself he would never be like them. He wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for something more. A future, a chance, a place to belong. But in a world that refused to see him, how long could he hold on? The night was colder than most. Jamal sat on a curb, his arms wrapped tightly around himself, watching people walk by, lost in their own lives. No one looked at him. No one noticed him. He was just another shadow on the street. And then he saw them. A sleek black sedan pulled up in front of the convenience store. A woman stepped out, blonde, elegant, expensive coat. She looked like she belonged to a different world. A world Jamal would never be a part of. But what caught his eye was not the woman. It was the men watching her. They moved like hunters. Slow. Calculating. Their hands buried in their jackets. Their eyes locked onto her like she was prey. Jamal knew what was about to happen before it even started. He had seen it before. The way fear paralyzed the innocent. The way power was stolen at gunpoint. The way the world ignored the helpless. And he had a choice. He could turn away, just like the world had turned away from him. Or he could prove that he was more than the shadow they saw him as. And that choice would change everything. Fear has a sound. It's the shallow breath of a store clerk staring down the barrel of a gun. It's the hushed silence of customers frozen in place. It's the quiet before chaos erupts. Jamal had seen this before. The way fear takes hold. The way time slows when a weapon is drawn. The way power shifts the moment a gun is introduced into the equation. He stood just outside the store, his heartbeat steady, but his mind racing. He wasn't supposed to get involved. This wasn't his fight. The streets had taught him that stepping into another man's war was a quick way to die. And yet, he couldn't look away. Inside, the woman, the blonde from the car, stood frozen, her back against a shelf. One of the masked men held a gun, pointing it at the cashier, his voice low and dangerous. "Open the register. Now." The clerk fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling so badly he dropped them. The second robber, thinner, more impatient, grabbed Kate by the arm and yanked her toward him. "Hey, sweetheart, you got anything for us?" Jamal exhaled slowly. He should walk away. He should disappear into the night. This wasn't his problem. He didn't even know her name. But then he saw it. The way her body stiffened. The way her breath caught in her throat. The way her eyes darted toward the gun, knowing, just knowing, that one wrong move would be her last. And that was when Jamal moved. He didn't think. He didn't hesitate. His feet carried him forward before his mind could catch up. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. The robbers turned sharply, startled by the unexpected intrusion. For a brief second, no one moved. Then, the one holding Kate sneered. "Keep walking, man. This ain't got nothing to do with you." Jamal's eyes flickered to the gun, to Kate, to the terrified cashier. And in that moment, he made a choice. "Let her go," he said, his voice even controlled. The gunman chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, you picked the wrong night to be a hero." And then it happened. The robber raised his pistol. Jamal lunged. It was instinct, survival, years of fighting for every breath, every meal, every scrap of dignity. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisting hard, forcing the barrel away. The gun went off, the shot deafening in the small store. Glass shattered. Someone screamed. The second robber panicked, shoving Kate away as he reached for something in his pocket. A knife? A second gun? Jamal didn't wait to find out. He threw his elbow back, catching the first man in the ribs before spinning to face the second. For a moment, he thought they might run, that the gunfire was enough to send them fleeing. But then, he saw the shift. The way the second man's eyes narrowed, the way his jaw clenched. This wasn't just a robbery anymore. This was personal. The gunman recovered, raising his weapon again. But before he could pull the trigger, Kate moved. She grabbed a metal can from a nearby shelf and swung it, slamming it into the side of his head. The man stumbled, cursing. The gun fell from his grip. Jamal didn't hesitate. He kicked the weapon away and shoved the man back, sending him crashing into a shelf. For a split second, it seemed like the fight was over. Then the second shot rang out. Time slowed. Jamal didn't think, didn't hesitate. He moved. The bullet wasn't meant for him. It was meant for her. But in that instant, in that single breath of time, he made the only choice that mattered. He threw himself in front of Kate. The pain came instantly, a searing, burning explosion tearing through his side. His knees buckled, his vision blurred. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed. The robbers ran. And as Jamal collapsed to the floor bleeding, he realized he had done something truly foolish. He had saved a woman who would never be able to save him in return. Pain is a strange thing. It comes in waves, crashing over you, drowning out everything else. But in the moments between, there is clarity. And in that clarity, there is fear. Jamal could feel the blood pooling beneath him, warm against the cold tiles of the convenience store floor. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. His body screamed, but his mind was focused on one thing. He was still alive. Barely. The sirens grew louder, closing in. The flashing red and blue lights painted the ceiling, dancing across broken glass and scattered merchandise. He heard voices, urgent, panicked, but they felt distant, like echoes in a dream. And then her face, Kate, she was hovering over him, her hands pressing against his wound, her breath shaky but determined. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice raw. "Please, stay with me." Jamal wanted to tell her that he'd try, that he wasn't ready to die on the floor of a store he couldn't even afford to shop in. But the words wouldn't come. He could only look at her, memorize her face, the way her golden hair framed her worried eyes, The way her lips trembled as she held on to him like he was something more than a stranger. More voices, more movement. The paramedics were here. Rough hands lifted him onto a stretcher. The world blurred, shifting between the fluorescent lights of the store and the endless sky above. For the first time in a long time, Jamal felt weightless. Hospitals smell like antiseptic and quiet desperation. They are filled with people waiting. Waiting for news. Waiting for hope. Waiting for the worst. Jamal drifted between consciousness and darkness. Pain pulled him back, but exhaustion dragged him under. He wasn't sure how much time had passed when he finally managed to open his eyes. The ceiling was white. Too white. The kind of white that didn't exist in the real world. Machines beat softly around him. His body felt heavy, like he had been buried under layers of lead. And then a voice, "You're awake." Kate. She sat beside his hospital bed, her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. There was relief in her eyes, but also something else, something he couldn't quite place. Jamal tried to speak, but his throat felt like sandpaper. He swallowed hard, wincing. "You," he croaked, barely recognizing his own voice. "You're still here." Kate let out a small laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Yeah. Well, you did take a bullet for me. Seemed only fair." He tried to smirk, but even that took too much energy. "You're lucky," she continued. "The doctor said the bullet missed any major organs. You lost a lot of blood, though. Another inch." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Jamal exhaled slowly. He had been close. Too close. "Why?" she asked suddenly, her voice softer now. "Why did you do it? You didn't even know me." He looked at her for a long moment. How could he explain that he had spent his whole life watching people walk past him, ignoring him, pretending he didn't exist? That for once, he had a chance to be something more than invisible. "Because I could," he finally said. "Because someone had to." Kate studied him, as if searching for something. And then, slowly, she nodded. A heavy silence filled the room. Not awkward, not uncomfortable, just there. And then the door opened. Jamal didn't have to be told who the man standing in the doorway was. He knew instantly. Senator Richard Williams. Tall, commanding, dressed in a dark suit that probably cost more than everything Jamal had ever owned combined. His presence filled the room, demanding attention, demanding obedience. And he was looking at Jamal like he was something that needed to be removed. Kate stiffened but didn't move from her seat. "Dad," she said carefully. The senator ignored her. His eyes never left Jamal. "You should have let her die," he said coldly. The words were like ice in Jamal's veins. Kate's eyes widened. "Dad, what the hell? Do you have any idea what you've done?" The senator snapped, his voice low and sharp. "You think you saved her, but all you did was make yourself a problem." Jamal said nothing. He just stared, absorbing the truth in those words. "You have no papers, no status, no protection, and now you're on my radar." Kate rose to her feet. "Dad, stop. He is an undocumented immigrant." The senator cut her off. "And I will not have my daughter's name tied to some nobody who shouldn't even be here." The words stung, but Jamal kept his expression blank. He had heard worse. Kate's voice shook with anger. "He saved my life." The senator's expression didn't change. "And I wish he hadn't." A sharp silence fell between them. Jamal felt the weight of those words settle over him, heavier than the pain in his side. Kate turned to him, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place. Guilt? Apology? Something more? "I'm sorry," she whispered. Jamal didn't answer, because in that moment he realized something. He wasn't just an undocumented immigrant anymore. He was a problem, and problems get removed. Love is supposed to be simple, a feeling that takes root and grows. But some loves aren't planted in soft earth. Some are forged in fire. Some are built in defiance of the world that says they should not exist. Kate Williams wasn't supposed to care. She wasn't supposed to feel anything for the man lying in that hospital bed. The man who had no papers, no rights, no home. He was a stranger, a ghost in a country that refused to acknowledge him. And yet, she couldn't walk away. The words her father had said still echoed in her mind, sharp and cold. "I wish he hadn't saved you." She had always known her father was ruthless, that he saw the world in black and white. But this was different. This wasn't politics. This wasn't policy. This was a man who had nearly died for her. And her father wished he hadn't. She couldn't accept that. She wouldn't. Jamal hadn't spoken much since the senator left. He didn't need to. The weight of reality had settled between them, thick and suffocating. He knew what was coming. He had lived in the shadows long enough to know when the light was about to turn against him. The system wouldn't care that he had saved a senator's daughter. The law wouldn't see him as a hero. It would see him as an inconvenience, a problem to be erased. Kate sat beside his bed, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing patterns on the blanket. "He's wrong, you know," she said softly. Jamal didn't look at her. "Doesn't matter if he's wrong. He has power. I don't." Kate's jaw tightened. "That doesn't make it right." "Right doesn't matter," Jamal said, his voice quiet but firm. "Not in my world." She turned to face him fully, searching his expression. "You don't have to go through this alone." Jamal finally met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw it. The exhaustion, the years of struggle, the weight of a life spent fighting for something that never seemed to come. "You don't understand, Kate," he murmured. "People like me, we don't get happy endings." Her heart clenched at the certainty in his voice, the quiet resignation, the acceptance of a fate he hadn't chosen, but had learned to live with. She refused to accept that. "Then we'll change that," she whispered. Together. Kate wasn't sure what she was doing. She wasn't sure why she cared so much, but something inside her refused to let this go. She had grown up in privilege, a life of wealth, of security, of doors that opened without resistance. She had never had to fight for her place in the world, but now she wanted to fight for his. Her father had power, but so did she. Maybe not in the same way, maybe not with the same reach, but she had something he didn't, a reason to care. The hospital room felt smaller now, the air heavy with unspoken things. Jamal shifted in his bed, wincing slightly as he moved. "What are you thinking?" he asked, his voice cautious. Kate took a deep breath. "That I don't know how to fix this, but I want to try." Jamal studied her, his dark eyes unreadable. "You don't owe me anything, Kate. I know." She exhaled, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I think I owe myself something. A chance to do what was right. A chance to stand up for something bigger than herself. A chance to prove that love, real, raw, unfiltered, was stronger than politics, stronger than fear, stronger than any law written to keep people like Jamal in the dark." Jamal didn't answer right away, but in the silence, something shifted, a thread connecting them, a moment suspended between fear and hope. Kate Williams had made her choice, and soon the world would know it. Love isn't supposed to be a battle, but when the world decides who is worthy and who is invisible, love becomes more than just a feeling. It becomes a fight. Kate didn't sleep that night. She sat by Jamal's bedside, watching him, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. The weight of the world felt heavier now, pressing down on her, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. She knew what was coming. Her father wasn't a man who let things go. He wasn't a man who allowed variables in his perfect world. And Jamal? He was a problem that needed to be erased. But Kate wasn't going to let that happen. Jamal stirred slightly, his eyes fluttering open. For a moment, he looked disoriented. Then his gaze found her. "You're still here." She nodded. "I told you I'm not going anywhere." A flicker of something passed through his eyes, something unreadable, something hesitant. "You should," he murmured. "Your life will be easier if you do." Kate let out a soft laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Maybe I don't want easy." Jamal exhaled slowly, looking away. "This isn't your fight, Kate. It is now." Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken things. She could feel the walls he had built around himself, the quiet resignation of a man who had spent too long fighting alone. But she wasn't going to let him do this alone anymore. She reached for his hand, her fingers brushing against his. "We'll figure this out. Together." For the first time in a long time, Jamal allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to fight alone. Morning came too soon, and with it, the reality they had been trying to ignore. The door swung open and two men in dark suits stepped inside. Their presence was suffocating, their expressions unreadable. One of them, a man with sharp features and a cold gaze, stepped forward. "Jamal Okoye?" Jamal tensed, his body instinctively preparing for the worst. "Yeah." The man pulled out a document. "You are under investigation for unlawful presence in the United States. You are required to attend a hearing with Immigration and Customs Enforcement." Kate shot to her feet. "A hearing?" She snapped. "He just got out of surgery. You can't." The man barely spared her a glance. "This isn't up for debate, Miss Williams." Jamal clenched his jaw, his eyes hard. "When?" 48 hours. "You will be transported to a holding facility. Until then." Kate's heart pounded. 48 hours. That wasn't enough time. That wasn't enough time to fight this. That wasn't enough time to save him. No. The word was out before she could stop it. "You can't take him." The agent's gaze flickered toward her, a hint of annoyance in his eyes. "I don't think you understand, Miss Williams." "No, I don't think you understand." Her voice was steel now, sharp and unwavering. "He's not going anywhere." Jamal looked at her, surprised. But Kate wasn't backing down. Not this time. She turned to the agent, her blue eyes blazing. "Do you have any idea who my father is?" The room shifted. The energy changed. The agents exchanged a glance, suddenly less certain. Kate took a step forward. "You want to take him? Fine. But I promise you, this will be a national scandal before the day is over. Do you really want that kind of attention?" For a moment, no one spoke. Then, finally, the agent sighed, tucking the document away. "We'll be in touch." They left without another word. The moment the door closed, Kate exhaled, her hands shaking slightly. She turned to Jamal, expecting him to be relieved. Instead, he was staring at her, his expression unreadable. "You just made yourself a target, Kate." She lifted her chin. "Then let them come." Jamal studied her for a long moment, then let out a soft laugh, shaking his head. "You really don't scare easy, do you?" "No," she admitted, "and I'm not going anywhere." Because this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about them. And she was ready for the fight. Love is supposed to be patient. Love is supposed to be kind. But when the world is against you, love becomes a race against time. Kate had bought them 48 hours. That was all. 48 hours before Jamal would be taken into custody. 48 hours before the system swallowed him whole. 48 hours to fight a battle that felt impossible. She refused to accept it. There had to be a way out. There had to be something she could do. Jamal, however, wasn't as hopeful. "This is how it works, Kate," he said, his voice steady, emotionless. "I knew this day would come eventually." She shook her head. "No, not like this." "Like what then?" He looked at her, tired but resigned. "You think they care that I saved you? You think they'll look at me and see anything other than an illegal immigrant?" His words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. Kate inhaled sharply. "We still have time." Jamal leaned back against the pillows, staring up at the ceiling. Time for what? What can you possibly do in 2 days? Her jaw tightened. Everything. Do you want to know what happens next? Please subscribe and turn on the notification bell to be alerted when we upload part 2.